Good morning. Good morning. My name is Era, and I am a 50-year-old woman with shortish hair, and sometimes I'm dressed up, sometimes I'm not. Let us begin by acknowledging that we are gathered on the traditional territory of the Upanska people, sometimes known by the name Osage. The descendants of the people who were forcibly removed from this land by colonists make up the Osage Nation. We acknowledge their continued struggle for justice.
Yeah, it's
Our chalice letter in the sanctuary. You have a chalice letter. Neil is our chalice letter. No, Christopher, I'm sorry.
That's the input from the computer.
We light our chalice in the words of Reverend Dr. David Breeden. Welcome to this place where equity and justice transcends mere dreams, where they are the air that we breathe. Enter this sanctuary, all who yearn for respite from a world rife with scarcity and inequity, rife with relentless shackles of privilege and bias and inequity. Come, embrace this space. Be embraced by this place, this refuge where scarcity and disparity dissolve into we together. Crafting a place where the breath of life is equity and justice. Cherished, manifested, sustained. See do what's right, feel all and comfort with your life. Chalice, chalice, burning bright. Chalice, chalice, burning bright. Well, see what's right, feel all and comfort with your life. Chalice, chalice, burning bright.
Reverend Tess Bonberger writes, "Let us make this earth a heaven. Let us make this earth a heaven right here, right now. Who knows what existence death will bring? Let us create a heaven here on earth where love and truth and justice reign. Let us welcome all at our pearly gates, our freedom table, amid singing and great rejoicing. Black, white, yellow, red, and all our lovely colors. Straight, lesbian, gay, bisexual, queer, questioning, cisgendered, transgendered, non-binary, gender non-conforming, healthy, sick, hurting, variously abled, young, old, gentle, cranky, joyous, sorrowing. Let no one feel excluded, let no one feel alone. May all have enough to meet their needs. May all share power generously. May all venerate the earth, our mother, and tend her with wisdom and compassion. May we make our earth an Eden, a paradise. May no one wish to leave her. May hate, violence, and warfare cease to clash in causes too old and tired to name. Religion, nationalism, racism, the false god of gold, deep-rooted ethnic hatreds. May these all disperse and wane. May we see each other's true selves. May we all dwell together in peace and joy and understanding. Let us make a heaven here on earth before it is too late. Let us make this earth a heaven for each other's sake.
Good morning.
Morning.
I'm Reverend Michelle Scott-Huffman. My pronouns are she, her. I am the minister here at First UU. I am a middle-aged, pale-skinned woman with short, spiky hair, wearing gray pants and a red plaid shirt. We're hoping for a little less volume. Or maybe just a little less squeal. So as we explore the theme of the gifts of justice and equity this month, we will kind of make our way through some different landscape. And the landscape of today's conversation is personal relationships. And sometimes we think of justice and equity on this sort of grand systemic scale. And it's quite possible that there's some work of justice to do in the relationships that are closest to us. So we're going to kind of get deep and personal today. Clarissa Pinkola Estes wrote in Women Who Run with Wolves, "Ours is not the task of fixing the entire world all at once, but of stretching out to mend the part of the world that is within our reach." And so it is that our focus on justice and equity gets personal this week. How many examples do we have of people who fought for justice and equity on a grand systemic scale, and we go to celebrate them when we remember their achievements, and then we find out that they were tyrants, cheats, emotionally unavailable in their relationships with the people they claim to love the most. Their most intimate relationships, or as we might say in community organizing, their private relationships. You see, in the field of community organizing, we get clear on the distinction between public and private relationships. And it's an important kind of distinction to make. Public relationships are those in schools and colleges, workplaces, and civic groups, the people with whom we may have close relationships, friendships even, but they exist on this kind of public domain, so to speak. Private relationships then are the ones with our families and closest friends. It's always a matter of more or less, not either or, but recognizing that in public settings, the goals are not necessarily intimacy, being liked, loyalty, but rather mutual accountability, respect, and getting things done. This is a place where we could spend a lot of time just unpacking that, because sometimes we come to our public relationships with the expectations of our private relationships, and those expectations will never be met. And then we can't get things done together because we find ourselves in this place of hurt and disappointment and anger. Today, I'm mostly interested in thinking together about how we navigate our private relationships and how we might ensure that we're building and nurturing just relationships in our private lives. When I say just in this case, I mean based on behaving according to what is morally right and fair. So just as in contributing to justice within our private relationships. In 2017, Douglas Kelly, professor of communication studies and applied ethics at Arizona State University, published the book Just Relationships: Living Out Social Justice as Mentor, Family, Friend, and Lover. Kelly's work is also highlighted on his website, relationshipart.com, where he talks about bringing intention and creativity to personal relationships so that we might learn to create our relationships rather than just letting them happen. I want to say that again. So that we might learn to create our relationships rather than just letting them happen. So many of us get sort of caught in the day-to-day minutia of life, and we find ourselves just letting our relationships happen with little intention and with little autonomy. And so we actually don't have to do that. So Kelly, using social science theory, examines interpersonal relationships through a social justice lens. As I was reading, studying, and preparing to write this message, I was struck first by Kelly's definition of just relationships as those relationships in which we are free to pursue our full humanity. They are moral and equitable partnerships characterized by some type of appropriate connection consisting of trust and respect and co-created space where each individual finds their own voice. Kelly asserts that our close personal relationships, those with our parents, children, closest friends, and romantic partners, are the most basic places where we practice justice. I am so thankful for the ways that I see many of today's parents, particularly in this space, practicing justice in their relationships to and with their children. Ways that may seem novel or even foreign to those of us who raised children in earlier generations. Ways that honor autonomy and consent in ways that those of us who grew up with the answer, no, because I said so, or do it because I said so. We just didn't experience that, and it's a beautiful thing to see. In developing his framework, Kelly, almost as if he spent the last month with us thinking and talking about the gifts of liberating love, explores love as the most efficient means of achieving justice in long-term relationships. Not sentimental love, he writes, but love based on commitment, deep emotional bonds, and other-centeredness, as well as advocacy, which he describes as love in action. As an entry point into the framework that Kelly offers, I want to invite folks in this room into a time of guided meditation. So I want to invite you to get comfortable where you are. I want to also invite you to know that in this whole worship space, there will likely be some sounds that you hear. And so invite you to a place where you think of this meditation as a way to kind of just engage with the words, the thoughts, and the questions, and not as some silent, sacred space where you need to engage with silence in some way. So find a posture that's comfortable for you and take a moment to breathe and to release the tension wherever it is that you're holding it. Now bring to mind the close personal relationships in your life. Relationships with your own parents, with children, with friends, with romantic partners. Hold with gratitude those that have been life-giving and fulfilling. Release with love and compassion, if not for them, for yourself, those that have been constricting, unequal, or unjust. Take a moment to reflect on some of your most important relationships, both just and unjust. And turn your thoughts to the foundation of just relationships. When have you felt valued, seen, and known for who you truly are? What kinds of words and actions have caused you to shrink from the fullness of your authentic self? What tools have you used or seen used that bring justice in a relationship? What is your hope for the close relationships in your life moving forward? Take a moment to reflect on your own needs, your hopes, and your dreams. And then let's take a breath together and come back to the wider conversation. Perhaps as we engaged in that brief guided meditation, you began to categorize some of your own relationships as just or unjust. And to think of the specific characteristics of the relationships that made them so. It's likely that we've all been a part of some interpersonal relationships where we and our relationship partners were free to pursue our full humanity, and some not so much. And perhaps that is true in both past and present tense for us. But what if we had tools to help ensure that those relationships were just, that our participation in them were building blocks to social justice and not stumbling blocks to divided lives, where we strive for justice in public while perpetuating injustice in our private lives? I think Douglas Kelly's work offers such a toolkit. In my work with young adults, my heart breaks over and over again as I encounter young people whose closest personal relationships have been some of the most unjust. Those whose parents force life and career choices on them that aren't what they want for themselves. Those who have had to be the adults in homes with parents who act emotionally immature or engage in dangerous behaviors. And those who have been rejected and maybe even thrown out for daring to name who they are with regard to sexual orientation and gender identity. Friends, it's incredibly hard to be a teenager. It always has been. Some of us have enough distance from that we imagine that it was easy, that we've rewritten history in such a way that we think, what's wrong with these kids today? Which is the same thing that the people our age were saying when they were our age, right? You know? The work of psychosocial development in that stage of life is not for the faint of heart, not for the person in it, or for the people supporting them through it. But the difficulty is exponentially greater when the young person doesn't feel like their home is a sanctuary from all of the struggles and pain that exists out there, in school, at work, in tenuous friendships and romantic relationships. Home, whether it's a place or the people who make it for us, should be the one space that a young person can count on to be safe, respectful, and loving. Likewise, in adulthood, we face so many challenges in our professional and civic lives, and I think all of us dream of a world where we get to retreat to the safety and security of partners and families with whom we get to take off all of our public masks and rest comfortably in ourselves, knowing that the people around us just get us and fully support our being. What sometimes happens, though, is that we're exhausted and run down from all of our performance out in the world, and a lack of intention and practice has us giving our worst interactions to those people we love the most. Cycles of guilt and shame, as well as a lack of practice in justice-based communication, get us and keep us stuck in what Kelly calls never-ending loops of anger, hurt, frustration, and hopelessness. So the idea of just relationships invites us to a process of negotiating a justice ethic with our relational partners before, or at least outside of, the moments when emotions are high and communication is something less than respectful. In these negotiations, the parties of the relationship co-create what they agree to be fair in the relationship, including distribution of resources, outcomes, and effort. In this negotiation, Kelly notes that it's important to recognize that in different interactions with our loved ones, we will need to respond to whether the call to justice is based on equity, equality, or need, all of which come into play at different points in our relationships. But knowing where the need is, where the response needs to connect to, helps us to maintain relationship goals over the long term. So for example, in times when one partner is experiencing significantly greater need, whether it's physical or emotional, a just relationship has already created the space for the partner with less need in the moment to give more to care for the other. In these times, we are hopefully less concerned about equity of resource distribution or equality of physical, mental, or emotional labor. And we're all in to take care of the needs of the person that we're in relationship with, knowing that when we are in our times of greatest need, that person is leaning in to our need and responding in that way. Underlying all of these negotiations and renegotiations is a foundation of respect that the parties agree will remain even in the most heated disagreements or challenging moments. Kelly leans on Marshall Rosenberg's nonviolent communication as a part of the toolkit to maintain this foundation. I wonder, the folks in the room, in the relationships that are closest to you, are there rules for your fights? And some of us think, we should just think we're not gonna fight, and we don't need to make rules for it. Well, let me tell you, folks in relationships, and also folks in a church, that's not real. It seems likely that most of us enter into our close personal relationships with all the best intention, at least the relationships that we got to choose. But somewhere along the line, we find ourselves intertwined in deep personal relationships that aren't built and maintained with ideas of justice and equity at the center. And it turns out humans are complex and complicated. So Kelly names some of the barriers to just relationships as divergent worldviews that have us framing relationships through different lenses. Well, my parents did it this way, and my grandparents did it this way, and those two things are completely at odds. And how do we navigate that? Those different lenses are based on our life experiences and cultural influences. Next, he names as a barrier the dehumanization of the other. And he talks about this coming from our tendency toward tribal kind of feelings and hopes. And that when we are faced with something that's different from our own life experience or cultural experience, that we tend to sort of dehumanize that thing and then that person who thinks or believes or acts in a particular way. The next barrier that he names is our need to save face at all costs. Now, this is one that we're all like, oh no, that's not me. I can be like honest and but I think the reality is when we're confronted with something that we've done that's harmful to another person, our first response is, how do we save face? How do I make it look like, A, that's not what I intended, B, you misunderstood what you experienced, like all of these different ways of trying to make it look like we didn't do the thing that we actually might just have done. And of course, the last barrier is shame and blame, this sort of cycle that goes on and on. So given that those barriers are fairly consistent and persistent in our human behavior and interpersonal communication, how do we form just relationships? Kelly offers a few things. The first one is resilience, which Ann Maston has called ordinary magic. Kelly writes, resiliency is our natural state. When we act in resilient ways, we are tapping into our ordinary magic. Resilient people are secure in who they are and the basic possibilities of their relationships, even when the circumstances look grim. Resilience is, in some ways, is like a muscle that we can exercise together, building it into the foundations of our relationships, but also leaning into it when things go awry, as they always will. Kelly writes, a central element to creating and maintaining resilient, just relationships is to understand one's own risk and potential for risk. To the extent that each partner in a relationship understands their own triggers or activation points, it becomes possible to proactively create protective factors. This kind of intentional communication both exercises and builds resiliency and trust. If we are to be honest, many of us know the sort of activation points for the people that we're in closest relationships with. And in some of our worst moments, we lean into those, right? Rather than creating proactively the space where there are protective factors around those kind of activation points. So Kelly says that next is the way that we engage conflict and learn to balance power. Conflict is inevitable. Avoidance, much to the chagrin of those of us who default to it, is generally not a helpful tactic. So what do we do with conflict? What if we learn in our relationships to use it, to use that tension as a creative force? To find those moments of conflict and to be able to name, I think we're in a moment of conflict. What are the factors that are sort of at play here? And what are the tools that we have to navigate this conflict in a way that respects one another, in a way that protects those points of previous trauma or harm that have been done? Next is forgiveness. Not the kind of forgiveness that says, I'm gonna just turn the other cheek every time there's something that happens in a toxic relationship, but the kind of forgiveness that frees us from the constraints of negative emotions. Because when we find ourselves stuck in our harm and our hurt and our anger, without doing the work to process it ourselves and to free ourselves from that, we tend to then be perpetrators in some way, in some other relationship. Forgiveness is the work of granting mercy and empathy. It's the work of renegotiating the relationship. And sometimes that renegotiation means there's no relationship anymore, that the relationship has ended, and that's the way that we have renegotiated how to exist in this whole of human space together. Oftentimes, forgiveness is a one-sided experience where I've done the work to forgive someone in my life who hasn't ever actually even owned up to the thing that they did that I needed to forgive. And the freedom is in my being able to release myself from that without waiting for them to do their own work. And finally, renegotiating the relationship each time a breach has happened creates space for reconciliation. So Kelly believes that all communication is reconciliation, but that the kind of reconciliation that's often needed relies on trust and commitment, apology, emotional healing, setting boundaries, and imagining a hopeful future. And so trust and commitment are those things that we have to work on, right? That we have to continue working together with the people in our lives, knowing that there will be failures, and that when we renegotiate our relationship after those failures, this is, by the way, the work of covenant, whether it's in a personal relationship or a public relationship, that we build trust, that we deepen our commitment to sort of stay in this thing. And let's talk about apologies. I'm sorry that you felt that way. It's not an apology. All of the different ways that we give non-apology apologies to try and get ourselves to go back to the saving face thing. We have to practice recognizing when someone has been harmed and just apologizing with our whole hearts, with a desire to do better, and with a real recognition of the ways that our words and actions may have caused harm, even when we didn't intend them that way. That then is a road to emotional healing. That then creates the space to setting boundaries. I'm just gonna say that as like middle class, white, kind of privileged people, setting boundaries is a thing that's hard for us. It goes against that idea of kind of niceness and polite interactions, that somehow we just need to give all the people all the access that they want to all the parts of our lives. When in reality, the kindest thing that we can do in our relationships, both private and public, is name those boundaries and then maintain them, care for them, continue to lean into them and to talk about them and why they matter. And a part of reconciliation, and finally, is imagining a hopeful future. If we can't imagine that we are in a just relationship, then we're going to have a hard time living into one. And so imagination is a big part of this work of relationship. So I'm going to close with some striking words that Douglas Kelly used to close his book on just relationships. It's part poem, part confession, and part prescription. I thought I saw you, but I only saw my own reflection. I thought you were free, but I didn't understand where you came from. I talked at you, but I never met you. I spoke of you, but I never knew you. I never knew me. And so may we take this offering today and work to make our private, personal relationships just, so that we can be energized to go out into the world and work for justice on a wider scale and not break someone's heart 50 years from now when they want to talk about what we did. And then they find out that we were not a nice person to the people we claim to be. Let's do that. Blessed be and amen.